Hello and welcome to our lecture on youth to adulthood. This is a transition that we're going to be looking at from a disability perspective. I am Kathy Shepard-Jones with the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky, and I am going to be providing an overview today for you on this very important aspect of human growth and development. So let's take a little step back here and think about what it is that we're talking about. The construct that we're looking at is really the construct of youth. Well, the idea of youth is not just recent, it's also geographical and cultural. If you look at this, much before the Industrial Revolution, the idea wasn't even held. You were a child until you weren't. Then you were an adult. You were a child until you could go about doing the work that needed to be done. Then you were considered an adult. So the concept of youth really is that middle ground. And researchers have chosen to approach the idea of youth from a variety of different ways. There is a cultural approach and youth as a culture. Do you think there is a culture of youth? Well, I do. And the culture comes from the music that you listen to where you hang out, to what you wear. And from this perspective, as youth, how we fit into this youth culture depends on many factors. And that can include one's position in the family. An oldest child may have more responsibilities and may not be able to take part in as many of the cultural activities as other youth. Socioeconomic status can also play a large role in the acceptance and acculturation of this youth culture. If you can't afford to buy the brand names that everyone is wearing, those kinds of things can affect how you fit in with the youth culture. Now, we also know that there's a structural approach. As I said before, previously and historically, we talk about childhood, we talk about adulthood. That piece of youth or adolescence really fills in the gap very nicely between those other two constructs of childhood and adulthood. And from a physical body approach, the media in particular tells us that youth is the time in life when it's about as good as it's going to get. And this is when our bodies are supple, strong, and beautiful. So what happens if you find yourself as not fitting into the ideal of what is appropriate for the youth culture? Well, self-doubt, low self-esteem, withdrawal, and these are all things that happen regardless of whether or not a youth has a disability or not. So this period of youth or adolescence, it's really a time of growth and change. This is the typical teenage years that we're talking about. And the biggest part of adolescence is we associate it with puberty and reproductive development. And puberty is happening at a younger and younger age. And what's taking place here is menstruation for females, and for males it's ejaculation and production of sperm. So this is the time in life when the human animal is able to reproduce itself. And when adolescence starts and when we move out of adolescence really vary by our culture and the country that we live in. But regardless, there are certain milestones that we expect to be achieved in adolescence here in the United States. And you might take a second to think about what some of those milestones might be. For many adolescents, a huge milestone is getting that learner's permit, and followed by being able to drive. Sex and sexual identity and actual sexual activity may be taking place during adolescence for the first time. Jury duty, the ability to become of legal age and enter into contracts, the ability to vote, And during adolescence is also when we are expected to leave high school and sometimes to get married. So these are very complex events that happen in life, and big decisions are being made here. This is also a time when the role of the parent is expected to change. And in many ways, the parents are expected to really take a step back and let that adolescent go ahead and spread their wings and fly or fail. Now, as you know, Erickson talks about this stage of development as a time of identity versus role confusion. We start to think about identity for ourselves when we are adolescents, not as how others may project their ideas on us. Adolescence is a time of exploration and experimentation. And this is really when the adolescent is saying, well, who am I and how do I really fit? What are the kinds of things that a typical adolescent might be concerned about? Well, an adolescent is concerned about friends and relationships, concerned about fitting in. This is when we are exploring aspirations and possible future selves and roles. What is our fit in society at large? What are our personal beliefs and values? What might we be interested in terms of an occupation? And what is our sexual identity? What is our sexual orientation? So what is society telling adolescents around this time? Well, society is providing a wide range of lifestyles and options, ways to make a living, ways to behave, ways to express oneself, ways of thinking. And so it's that interaction here that happens when the adolescents are exploring their identities and testing out how society and culture reacts to their own trial expressions of these identities. And that's when there can be conflict, when the adolescent may be trying something out that society is responding, not so good. So society here is really represented by the adult supports in that adolescent's life. And if the adults are encouraging and supporting of exploration and identity and offering up new possibilities to explore, and if adults are patient in their support, then adolescents are going to develop a willingness to seek out, experiment, and eventually commit to aspects of their identity. But if adults are opposing or interfering or forcing adolescents into premature commitments, then adolescents may choose identity without exploring or may postpone that exploration process altogether. And that's where we come up with role confusion. And I think a good example of this is when we think about parents. And sometimes parents really very much want their teenage children to follow in their footsteps, or conversely, to avoid the mistakes that they've made. So they may be pushing the adolescent away or toward whatever their idealization is about who they are supposed to be. So you think about the sullen teenager, and you think about the parents who are really pushing and trying to mold that teenager into something, make them be better. And then you get the butting of heads that goes along with that. And you can wind up with a teenager who's not really able to move on. Has anybody ever kind of seen this before? Think about that. So, if we consider all of the things that are going on in adolescence, if you add on top of that the adolescent also happens to have a disability, there are other things that kind of need to figure into this. And we know that there have been vast improvements in the lives of people with disabilities. Research shows that oftentimes it's not about having the right technology or access to the educational system, but what is it about in terms of an adolescent? In terms of adolescence, we're looking at friendships and those close personal relationships. And for an adolescent who happens to have a disability, there can be physical barriers and there can be social and attitudinal barriers. And some physical barriers might be very simple things that can totally exclude someone with a physical disability from participating. If everyone is hanging out in the back of the movie theater and adolescent with a disability using a wheelchair can't get there, they're not part of that group. If everyone's hanging out in the top of the bleachers following the pep rally, again, the adolescent with a mobility impairment isn't going to be part of that crowd. And a lot of times transportation is a very big part of that and fits in as well, because if you can't get to where everybody is going to hang out with them, then you're not part of that group. Now, research shows that for youth with disabilities, that network of friends can be really elusive. And tied to that is community participation and recreation. And we're working on an initiative in recreation right now in Kentucky. We've surveyed educators and asked those who work with kids with disabilities, do they participate in recreation activities? Overwhelmingly, they said no. And let's think for a minute about some of the barriers to recreation. Well, some of those are similar to those barriers to relationships. And they can be physical barriers. They can be lack of family involvement, that transportation issue. And some educators also said that it was student characteristics that were excluding students from participating. Might be a characteristic of the disability itself or behavioral issues. All in all, there was lack of opportunity. Now, we typically develop our recreational interests when we're young, and we do things that our friends like to do, or we venture out to try something new that a friend has experience with. But if you've never been kayaking and a friend has, they'll say, I'll show you, it's easy. But if you don't have those relationships, those people to show you the way, how do you take advantage of recreational opportunities? Article after article describes the phenomenon of students with disabilities recreating where? In front of the television. Now, one shift in our society has leveled the playing field for kids with disabilities. And there are some recreation activities that are very popular and very non-discriminatory. If you consider online gaming, the Wii, social networking, and some advantages there are that everybody's doing it. It removes the focus from disability, and it allows for the development of a network of friends that could potentially be international. Now, that's pretty cool stuff. The flip side, the disadvantages, the cost of the technology to take part. What if your family doesn't have enough money to have internet access in the home? Those Wiis are kind of expensive. And those sorts of recreation activities are also isolating. And they don't bring with them the health benefits that we associate with sports, team activities, outdoor recreational kinds of things. So additionally, when that youth or adolescent has a disability, we don't talk about sex much either, but we're going to talk about that more here in a second. And health. And I think that that's another really, really important piece of the puzzle. And what ties all of these things together really is the idea of planning and the importance of making sure that you've kind of mapped out what this journey is going to look like, because it can require a little bit more in the way of supports and services that might be necessary for the adolescent to have a healthy and safe transition. So now, sex. There's a lot of myths out there regarding disability, and these are all things that adolescents are facing when they're at a time in their lives when they are truly developing their sexual identity. And what are we telling adolescents with disabilities? Well, we see youth with disabilities oftentimes as being asexual, and depending on the disability, of course, Have you ever heard the phrase of eternal children? Think about why people might consider that. Other youth with disabilities, depending upon the disability, may be considered sexually threatening by society and culture. And also, the idea of disability and homosexuality is really, really not talked about. When the youth has a disability, we sure don't talk about homosexuality and heterosexuality because it's just assumed that that youth is going to be heterosexual in a very non-threatening sort of way, if we are even going to talk about sex. And that there's sort of an overwhelming majority that feel that there is no need for sex education. We did an article recently looking at the lack of education in reproduction for youth with developmental disabilities, and it's just not out there. And why is that happening? Well, that mostly seems like a societal response, and one of our mores in saying that we don't really want to go there. And all in all, practitioners have felt that same way. And so if the people in medical fields are avoiding these conversations, then by golly, that means that we need to stay away from it. So that's unfortunately a huge myth, because we're seeing that people with developmental disabilities who are going to be youth, adolescents with disabilities who are growing up to become adults with disabilities, and they are having children. And this is diametrically opposed to the idea that sterilization can be an appropriate response for reproductive health if a youth has a disability. And in 1924, Virginia adopted a statute that authorized the compulsory sterilization of people with intellectual disabilities. And this went up to the Supreme Court, Buck versus Bell, in 1927. And the Supreme Court upheld the decision that instituted compulsory sterilization when it was for the protection and health of the state. And in this particular instance, an 18-year-old woman with an intellectual disability who had already had a baby was forcibly sterilized. And there's lots of cultural things that go around this, making it a real interesting story to consider, because it's been said that this woman, Carrie, had actually been raped, and it was by her mother's nephew, and she was later sent to an institution sort of as a way to kind of wash away the shame on the family, and she was therefore forced to carry this burden. And sterilization really went on for several years, and this, we're talking about the 1900s here. This is not a long time ago. And it really wasn't until I think 1974 where sterilization was banned across all of the states. Some states did sort of hang on to their old laws that would allow sterilization. So if we look at health needs for adolescents with disabilities, I like to think about the question, can one be healthy and have a disability? Is it possible? Well, of course it's possible. We need to think about health in different terms. Health exists across the spectrum for people with disabilities, and it's when someone is young where they're developing their nutrition practices, when they need to be educated about the impact of tobacco, alcohol, and other substances, when they need to be taking on an exercise regime, as well as considering those personal hygiene sorts of things, along with reproductive education. All of these fit into a person's physical and also emotional health. And just because an adolescent happens to have a disability doesn't mean that they need to be excluded, that others are going to be making these choices for them. Because if they're not learning these skills now, then how are they going to have them later on in life? And we all know that that adolescents are getting more and more unhealthy. So we need to make sure that we're not completely excluding that population, that subgroup within adolescents who happen to have disabilities, and excluding them from information that's just as valuable, if not more valuable. Because if a child or an adolescent has a physical disability and isn't eating healthy, isn't eating nutritious food, and is maybe becoming overweight, that makes everything else in that person's activities of daily life that much harder. Makes it harder to be mobile. It makes it harder to be included in activities. It makes it harder for transportation. So these are all things that we think of kind of automatically that kids need to start thinking about. And here in the state of Kentucky, we're one of the unhealthiest states, and we need to be making real strides in changing that. Self-determination is a phrase you may have heard before, and it is something that is often developed for adolescents as they are gearing up and heading toward adulthood. We do little things to make us more self-determined. This phrase has caught fire, really, in the disability field as something that's very important to keep in perspective for people with disabilities. And Michael Waymeyer has described self-determined actions as those that in which one acts as the primary causal agent in one's life and makes choices and decisions regarding one's quality of life free from undue external influence or interference. Important words for anyone. They take on a special poignance when you consider a person who has a disability. So let's talk for a minute about some of the finer points of self-determination. The principles of self-determination, there's really 4. And the first is freedom, and that is the freedom to be able to plan your own life. The second is authority, the ability to have the control over your life. Autonomy, choice, responsibility. Well, that's the accountability. So if you've got the freedom to make the decisions, you've also got to take the responsibility when maybe it doesn't work out as you had hoped. The values that follow around self-determination include respect, choice, ownership, support, and opportunity. Self-determination is not a model or a program with a predetermined menu of available services and a set way of delivering them. Self-determination is a process that differs from person to person according to what each individual determines is necessary and desirable to create a satisfying and personally meaningful life. Adolescents with disabilities don't have to receive services as determined by the traditional model. And these are things that we need to really keep in mind when working with youth of transition age who have disabilities. And one of the ways that we do this is by helping to encourage decision making. Youth need to be included in all of the decisions that affect their lives. They need to be part of the discussion, and they need to be participating in the IEP process. Now, the IEP is the Individualized Education Program, and that is really the roadmap for students who receive special education services in the school. And there is at least a yearly meeting that takes place to look at progress that a student is making toward goals and for setting new goals. Also, in decision making, we need to make sure that we're promoting education. We know that education pays. We know that students who have disabilities are experiencing higher dropout rates than students without disabilities, nearly double. A student with a disability also may choose to stay in the school system past the traditional age of 18. Student with a disability receiving special education services may stay in that school system until he or she is 21. And when the student does exit high school, he may be exiting with a diploma or maybe exiting with a certificate, and that means very different things. And once exiting high school, people with disabilities are at a higher risk for all kinds of negative outcomes. People with disabilities are at higher risk for living in poverty. People with disabilities are twice as likely to be unemployed, twice as likely not to have transportation, and more likely not to have health care. And 18% of people with disabilities don't have health care versus 7% of the general population. So there are big repercussions here when transition doesn't go well. And we think about this transition in adolescence out of high school and into the wide world beyond, just a sort of one big thing. But Paul Wayman really thinks of it as about seven things. And the transition could be to, first, we're talking about employment, or it could be a transition to post-secondary education. There's a transition in living arrangements. Is this adolescent going to stay at home, or is this adolescent going to move into a new living arrangement? Is the adolescent going to have free access to be mobile around the community, and how is that going to take place? Financial transition. Well, we think about opening bank accounts. We have a checkbook. We need to manage our money. How is that going to happen? We have transitions with our friends and our close relationships as people move away, or as we meet new friends, new adult friends. Then there's the big sex transition, because suddenly you're kind of considered an adult, aren't you? And I'm not going to really delve into that, but that is an area that we often just leave at the wayside. And what about the transition to recreational activities? If you're not at school and you may not have the same friends that you're hanging around with, how are you spending your time when you're not working or you're not in school? What activities are you going to do to fill up the rest of your day? And I think that it's very important to consider some of the barriers that exist to successful transition. And service delivery systems can have huge implications on the success or failure as a student exits the education system and enters the world of adult services. You're moving from a school-based entitlement system into a world where you have to be determined eligible first. You have to be determined eligible for Medicaid if you're not already receiving those benefits. You have to be determined eligible for voc rehab services. You have to be determined eligible for certain waivers that you might want to take advantage of. And what goes hand in hand with that is the idea that oftentimes there are long waiting lists for services because funding is limited and sometimes service providers are not available. And in a school setting, we usually think of services as being pretty coordinated. You know, you've got sort of your team that works with you to make sure that your goals are being met. But suddenly, once you're out of school, there isn't so much of a coordinated service system that's going to make sure that you've got one-stop shopping and that all of your needs are being met. You may have a case manager who is helpful, but the case manager isn't necessarily taking care of your medical needs as well as your residential needs, as well as your recreation needs, and all of those things intertwining. But a case manager can help to sort of streamline that process somewhat. I think another important barrier to successful transition is the idea of learned helplessness. And if you are an adolescent who has never had the opportunity to make those decisions for yourself, someone else is always coming along saying, I can do this for you because I can do this faster, I can do this better, you don't need to worry about it. Eventually, you just stop trying to do things on your own. So the next thing you know, suddenly you have no idea how to do something on your own. You don't know how to get yourself from bed in the morning out the door. There's a lot of tasks that are involved in that. And if there's not been the expectation that you will do this and that somebody else is always going to be there to make the decisions for you as far as what you're going to wear, how you're going to get into what you wear, how you're going to comb your hair, then you can't be expected to understand how all of this works. So going really hand in hand along with that is the idea that you have to plan to make these things work, and that it can involve some long-range planning. I used to be a case manager for HDI's assessment clinic, and I would work with an interdisciplinary team, and we would get involved usually with a school assessment for students who are receiving special education services. I would oversee the assessments and reporting that was done by the various disciplines who were called in, possibly physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, psychology, and whomever else was needed to be involved. And at the end of the assessment, everyone would get together and discuss the strengths of the student and the areas of concern for the family. And every time we had a student who was in high school, I would discuss transition and plans after high school. And honestly, none of the families had given a whole lot of thought to what was going to happen a couple of years down the road. And consider why that might be. Well, oftentimes for families, the impact of disability can be really almost just overwhelming. And getting through the day or getting through the school year is the main concern. You're not thinking that far ahead as to what's going to happen when school is over. And really, it might be a pretty daunting thought, because at the point when the adolescent is in school, at least you know what the days are going to look like. And change can be a really very frightening thing, even though it can lead to great opportunities. Still, sometimes what's known, even if it's bad, is better than the unknown. So there are many ways that we can empower youth and adolescents by providing those opportunities to make decisions, to start setting those goals, to do those things early. Utilize the internet and all that it brings along with resources and opportunities, and to take advantage of technology. And by technology, I'm talking about rehabilitation technology or assistive technology. Any of those devices or services that can help to maximize a person's functional abilities and minimize the impact of disability. And parental involvement is so important, because if the parents don't have high expectations for the adolescent or the youth, then it's going to be real hard to expect that youth to go on and achieve beyond those expectations. But keep in mind, this is the time of identity that's going on, and think back to Michael Kennedy and the things that he was thinking about from a very young age. He knew that he had to speak out, and he knew what he wanted for himself. So when this stage of development goes well, you're going to develop that sense of self and that sense of identity and know what your roles are. So that can be a very exciting time. So we need to make sure that we're taking advantage of all the strategies that we can that empower youth. And an additional strategy that you may have heard mentioned a time or two relate to person-centered planning. And person-centered planning is an excellent way to identify goals. You set goals, and then you also identify how you're going to reach those goals. And person-centered planning often works as a team, and but the tools and the skills that you use in person-centered planning can be done just one-on-one. It can be self-directed if you're able to, but person-centered planning is a way to identify the people and the resources that are necessary to be successful. And right now, if you would go ahead, and I want you to think about all of the people who are in your life. We're going to do a relationship map. Put yourself in the center of the piece of paper, and then just draw a little stick person and put a name over it of the people that are in your life, and identify them as either natural support or paid support. Now, a natural support is, well, loosely, it's somebody who's not paid to be part of your life, okay? So, put a little NS next to the person's name, or a PS. So again, this is the relationship map, and you're putting yourself in the center, and you're identifying all of the people who are in your life, paid versus unpaid. So for people with disabilities, sometimes in their adult lives, all of the relationships that person may have may be a paid relationship as opposed to a natural support. And think about what that's going to mean to the opportunities that person has, and to the quality of life that person is experiencing. But I think why this is a valuable tool is because once you identify the relationships that you have, you can also go ahead and identify those relationships that aren't going to help you to reach those goals. So you might not be identifying those as people to help you get where you need to go. And that's valuable to know as well. But you might decide, well, my next door neighbor is a person that I know every weekday at 9 o'clock goes downtown to work, and maybe I can get a ride with them if I'm going to go on to the technical college, and I know that my class is at 10 o'clock. So combining the relationship mapping along with other goal setting strategies and using this general person-centered planning idea can be one way to help you think about where it is that you are now and where you want to be, and the steps that will get you there. So as a professional, what are the things that we need to be thinking about? Well, we need to think about the transition needs of the individual student. We need to check out the IEP, the individual education program, see what's in there, see if it's being met, see if there's some gaps, some things that aren't happening, some things that need to be there that aren't. We need to identify ways that are going to help to make the transition out of school and into the adult world easier. And we talked a little bit about some of those transitions, if it's going to be a career, if you're wanting to work after you get out of school, you need to be thinking about those goals, maybe doing some vocational assessments, some shadowing, having those job-based experiences, and have a sense of what kind of money will this job be bringing in. If you want to go on to school, and again, really, these are all things that everybody needs to think about. They just take additional steps sometimes when the student happens to have a disability. Because if you want to go on to school, again, what are the goals there? Why are you going? What kind of accommodations are you going to need? Are you going to need some physical accommodations? Are you going to need some additional help and tutoring? Do you need study guides, extra help there? What about financial aid? Independent living. What is the plan? Where do you want to be? Do you want to stay in the town that you're in now? Do you want to be somewhere else? What is your life going to look like? Is there going to be a guardian involved, or will the person be independent? What kind of medical needs might be part of daily living that need to be taken into consideration? And what is a person's independent living skills now? I mean, I think about a lot of teenagers in high school. Are they ready to take on dishes and laundry? Probably not, unless they're going to be piling them up somewhere. So these are ubiquitous to the adolescent. And again, we go back to leisure and recreation. What's that going to look like? Is volunteering going to be a part of life? And it should be. And we want to make sure that we're focusing on the individual. Sometimes we get sort of lost in what's available, what's out there. If it's not a good fit, you shouldn't go down that road, because we need to be advocating for the student. So we need to know that student well and know what that student's dreams and desires are. And if that student doesn't know for him or herself what those dreams and desires are, then we need to try to make as many opportunities available as we can. So you can have some choice and say, I like this, but I don't like that. I like being outside, but I don't like all the structure. And we need to make sure that we are educating the educators, the professionals, that we aren't getting stuck in our own ways. And we need to make sure that students are developing those skills that they might not have, whatever those skills may be. I met with a high school senior who is planning on coming to the University of Kentucky, and he has multiple disabilities and communication. For him, primarily, he communicates with a communication board. So they're programmed phrases and words that are already available to him that he can use. But his speech therapist felt that it was so important to work with him on having just a few words that he could verbalize. So he says yes and no. And that, if you think about the difference that makes for him just in interaction, that is vast and enormous. So those are the things that he's working on. And all of these other things: technology, organization, career awareness, interpersonal skills, problem solving, conflict resolution, and self-advocacy, important for all adolescents and youth who are getting out of high school to have a good sense of. And if we're thinking about who might be part of this planning team, the person-centered team or a transition team, the student needs to be part of it. Parents, educators, counselors, adult service providers who may wind up being in the loop, and most importantly, whomever is significant in the life of that student. Because what we know is that youth belong in their communities where they choose that to be. Youth need to be supported to make those transitions as seamlessly as possible. And we should only be providing services that are as special as they have to be. Generic services, natural supports are going to be far superior than complex and highly regulated, specialized programs. And we try to take a family-centered approach and a person-centered approach. Family is so important to have them on board, but at the end of the day, it's ultimately the adolescent's life that we're talking about. And we need to try to find answers when things aren't going well within the community itself. You go and you work with an individual employer, you get a sense of what the community is like, what the needs are in the community, and how might you be able to make a connection that's going to significantly improve somebody's quality of life, be it in work, be it in school, or independent living, recreation, health, sex, whatever it is, whatever is important to that student. And there's a lot of good resources that are out there, and I would encourage you to take a look at some of them. These are disability-related resources, but I think that when we have the discussion about adolescence and transition, that there's a lot of ground that's been covered already. But if you take it as an individualized approach and be creative and problem solve, then you are going to help ensure that that person has a good transition and gets started on the right foot. So I thank you for listening, and please go ahead and view the additional video materials that are meant to supplement this lecture. Thank you very much.